Born ready? Okay. Hello everyone. Okay, this is working. We're good. Welcome to Manuel's River. My name is Madison. I'm a science interpreter here at Manuel's River, and we are here tonight to talk about the environment. So I'm joined by some lovely candidates, lovely moderator. I'm not going to speak at you for very long. I'm going to let them do the talking, but I just want to thank you all for coming out here today. Our moderator is Catherine Lear. She grew up here in CBS. She's from Foxtrap. She's been traveling all over the world. Recently came back to Newfoundland. We're really lucky to have her. And she's a communications professional with MUNS. She knows all about good communicating. She's going to keep this debate on track. So I'm going to turn it over to her to give you some rules and some housekeeping items.
Thanks, Madison. Am I on?
No.
Am I on now? Yes. Hello. Okay, as Madison said, I am Catherine, and I am your moderator this evening. So thanks everyone for coming out to the Manuel's River Interpretation Centre. This debate is part of 100 debates on the environment, which I think at last count, and Madison, correct me if I'm wrong, we're at 116 across the country. And these debates are an initiative of Green Pack, which is a non-partisan, non-profit organization working to elect and support environmental leaders of all major parties running for office. So 100 Debates on the Environment has a simple mission, and that's to make the environment an issue that no party and no candidate can ignore by organizing more than 100 inclusive, politically neutral, and environment-focused all-candidates debates in communities across Canada. This is an unprecedented initiative. It's coordinated issue debates have never been held on this scale in Canada. So I'm just going to explain a little bit about how the debate will run. Each candidate will have a chance to provide an introduction and a conclusion, as well as provide an answer in 3 minutes or less to each of 7 questions that will be posed. The order in which the candidates will make introductions, respond to questions, and provide concluding remarks was determined randomly before we began. So each candidate will then have the opportunity to provide up to 3 2-minute rebuttals. Each candidate has 3 colored pieces of paper that they can use at their discretion to offer a rebuttal after the other candidates have replied to a question. They will hold up the paper to alert me that they wish to make the rebuttal, and once they have made it, they can deposit their slip in the rebuttal box that's there in front of them. So the candidates we have here tonight, we have right next to me here is Greg Malone representing the Green Party. Liberal candidate is Ken Macdonald, and Movelle is the NDP candidate. So Conservative candidate Matthew Chapman was invited, however declined the invitation, and without an indication as to why. So finally, a few housekeeping notes. Your phones, if you've checked them, please check them again and make sure they're off. Also, this event is live streamed on Facebook, so the audience won't be in it, but just so you're aware of that. Finally, the bathrooms are located just outside the door here, and also there will be a audience question portion of the debate. So if you have a question, there's a box located outside as well, and you have up until 7:45 to put your question in the box, and they will pick, the volunteers are going to pick 3 questions out of those to pose to the candidates. So we can begin with our intros. Again, they were randomly selected of the order, so Ken Macdonald will be first with his introduction.
Well, just click it once and it should go.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Good evening, and it's great to be back here at the beautiful Manuel's River Centre in Manuel's this evening. Thanks to the organisers, and good evening to Leah and Greg, and all in the audience for coming out this evening. I think it's important for you to hear from your local candidates on issues of importance. I was born and raised here in Conception Bay South and currently still reside on Pond Road in Kelgrose, which I've done so for 58 years. As you know, I have represented this riding for the last 4 years, and I remain humbled to serve as the Member of Parliament. I believe that climate change is one of the defining issues of our time, and we're at the pivotal moment. Canadians know that climate change is real, and in the past 4 years, science has made it even more clear that the future of the planet is at risk. Young people understand this, and that's why they are marching in the streets demanding action. We can't afford to go back to the Harper years when Conservatives did nothing about climate change. We need to take our lead from young people and step up our fight against climate change. Thanks again for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to the discussion this evening.
So we have 2 minutes for introductions.
Okay. Thanks, Ken. Hi, I'm Greg Malone with the Green Party. Thank you all for coming out and showing your interest in this topic, and thank you very much for organizing it, to the Manuel's staff here. You know, every party has an environmental plank in their platform. Our platform is the environment. That's it. That's what we're running this campaign on, because we know that this is an existential issue at the moment, that we have 10 years only to do something meaningful about the climate crisis. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the UN, consisting of worldwide scientists from all over the globe and about 100 countries, has said this is it. This is our window, this is our time. If we don't do something now in the next 10 years, we will be shooting up to 2 degrees. And 2 degrees is runaway global inflation and climate chaos. And you can feel it every day in the air. Everyone knows it's out there. The storms are more intense. I don't need to go through the litany, because everyone knows it. Everyone I talk to on the doorstep knows it. The awareness of the environment in Avalon is 70 to 80% of concern about the climate crisis. That's what the polls are showing. The Green Party gets it. That is why it is at the top of our agenda, and it's the overarching policy which influences every other policy and colors every other policy. All our tremendous social justice policies are integrated into that, and every other policy we have is integrated into that. So we are the party of climate action. That's the heart and soul of the Green commitment. We know the time is now. We know that if we go up, we were trying to keep to 1.5 or below 1.5. We know we're not going to do that anymore because we haven't taken action yet. We're going to go to 1.5. That's because of the damage already done. Now the big challenge is to keep us from going above 1.5 and flirting with climate chaos. Climate chaos can come at 1.6, but we don't know that. We're going to find out. We don't want to find out.
Hi, my name is Movelle. I am a climate activist and a member of the Social Justice Co-op of Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm also a member of the first Coalition for Green New Deal for Newfoundland and Labrador, and I'm running to be your NDP representative in federal parliament. I grew up in rural Newfoundland, the daughter of 2 fish harvesters, watching my parents struggle to make a living in a neglected and stigmatized industry where the odds were stacked against them and in favor of corporate interests and profit. My parents taught me to respect our habitat and its offerings, to hunt only for food we needed to supplement our grocery bill, to plant and harvest vegetables in our yard, and take no more trout from the water than I'd eat. They taught me to have respect for all that lives alongside me, that I was not the center of anything, but one small part in a delicate ecosystem that allows us to live. I was 17 when I first started to feel climate anxiety. I was part of a group of students who arranged beach cleanups and talked to elementary school kids about turning off the lights when they left the room or turning off the tap when they were brushing their teeth. My parents supported me in these efforts but scoffed at the power of money and greed to render such choices meaningless through a broader lens. I studied political science and sociology at Memorial University out of a persistent and eerie feeling that the world we live in is gravely unjust. Through post-secondary education in social sciences and humanities, I learned that this feeling of injustice is real and widespread, rooted in a broken economic system that lets large corporate actors break the backs and spirits of working people and destroy our homes and communities in the name of profits that are shared only among a few elites and their shareholders. Politicians like to say they're with the little guy, that they're for the working class, but I'm running because I am the little guy, and I am the working class. And I won't compromise our voice, not even under the pressure of corporate lobbyists. Thank you.
Great, okay, thank you. Now we'll move on to the first question. And Leah, you are the first responder. So I'm just going to give a little introduction to the question. Around the world, we are seeing inspiring examples. Just making sure, sorry. Around the world, we are seeing inspiring examples of leadership to reduce greenhouse gas pollution and accelerate the shift to a green economy. At the same time, we are seeing a ramp up of the effects of climate change, and the scientific consensus is that we have little more than a decade to turn things around. We see extreme weather events across the country, including wildfires, flooding, and droughts. These are causing anxiety and worry, given their enormous financial and environmental impact. Per person, Canadians produce the most greenhouse gas pollution of all G20 industrialized nations, nearly 3 times the G20 average and over 20 tons per person. What are the key elements of an action plan that you will advocate for to ensure Canada meets its international obligations to reduce greenhouse gas pollution?
We must tackle the climate crisis and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by having the courage to acknowledge that our current economy is a central part of the problem. We must fundamentally change how we do business and the way we take care of our communities. Under politics and business as usual, multinational corporations are permitted to come into our communities, extract our natural resources at immense carbon costs, and leave us to clean up their mess. An NDP government would end subsidies to fossil fuel companies on day one. There is no good reason to give public money to oil companies who threaten the viability of our habitat to line their own pockets. As an MP, I will advocate tirelessly for favoring community-owned and community-managed projects over distant, large corporate control that puts our communities, our land, our water, and our futures at careless risk. The NDP has pledged to establish a Canadian climate bank to invest in the renewable energy we need to power our communities. The NDP has committed to supporting investments in community-owned and operated clean energy projects, working in partnership with Indigenous and Northern communities. To address greenhouse gas emissions from heating our homes and public buildings, our party will require large-scale building retrofits in all sectors, working with provinces to fund energy-efficient social housing, government buildings, and beyond, with a target to retrofit all housing in Canada by 2050. We will also update the National Building Code to ensure that by 2030, all new buildings are net zero energy ready and build 500,000 affordable homes over 10 years in the process. When it comes to how we get around, the NDP will electrify public transit by 2030. We cannot continue to rely primarily on private vehicles to get around, even electric vehicles, because this leaves out people who either cannot or struggle to afford cars. Our party has committed to working with interested provinces and municipalities to provide free low-carbon transit. As your MP, I will advocate for free green public transit in our province and for bringing train services back to Newfoundland and Labrador, this time in the form of electric trains to better connect rural areas. The fight for climate justice is about more than reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. We are a part of the environment. It's about following the leadership of Indigenous land and water protectors and centering communities and people that have been left behind by the Industrial Revolution and by corporate-controlled democracy.
Thank you, Leah. Next, Ken.
Thank you. We have a plan that's ambitious and serious. We have 50+ measures in all parts of the economy to cut pollution, adapt to the consequences of climate change, create jobs and clean growth, and we will do more. In the past 4 years, we've done more to fight climate change than any previous federal government in Canada's history. A Conservative government would undo all of that. Here are just a few of the items that would be at risk under a Conservative government. Our investment in over 1,200 public transit systems. Our plan to put a price on pollution, which will put money back into the pockets of Canadians. Our plan to invest in renewable energy. And our plan to ban harmful single-use plastics. This list is just a sampling of what we are jeopardising. It's why, as the Liberal candidate, I will build on my record of doing my part to protect the environment. For example, during my time on council in Conception Bay South, I worked hard to bring curbside recycling. I worked just as hard on the plan and implementation of diverting raw storage from being dumped into the ocean at Conception Bay. As part of the Liberal government, we have done a lot. There's a lot more to do. This election is critical for the environment. We have an incredible plan to fight climate change. We are working towards a net zero future where there are no carbon emissions or emissions are completely offset by other actions to remove carbon from the atmosphere. The Conservatives want to make pollution free again. A Conservative government would put all the progress Canada has made on fighting climate change at risk. Experts say the Conservative plan would do less and cost more. We are the only federal party that has implemented a real plan to balance the climate and the economy. We will continue to lead with a price on pollution and a plan to help reduce emissions and introduce a new rebate system that puts more money back in the pockets of Canadians. We have a new climate reality, and we will also help people and communities deal with the realities of increased climate-related risks and disasters. Do Canadians want to elect a Conservative government which has promised to roll back carbon pricing, or a government with a proven track record on the environment and a serious, ambitious plan to tackle climate change? I sat on the Fisheries and Ocean... Sorry, going into another one.
Okay. So this is about climate change. Fighting climate change, climate action is about reducing greenhouse gases, methane, CO2, stop dumping it into the biosphere. Okay, here's where the rubber hits the pavement. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the UN, at the UN, has determined that we need to reduce our emissions, our noxious gas emissions, by over 50% in the next 10 years, so that by 2030 we are over 50% less emitters than we are today. Every country agreed with that, except for two, Ecuador and some other country. Every country has agreed to those standards. Okay, so what do we have in Canada where we have been soft? There's no great boast to say we're better than Harper was, because Harper brought us backwards. So in Canada, the Liberals pledged a 30% reduction. The PCs couldn't be left with their pants down, so they pledged a 30% reduction too. And the NDP had to be a little bit better, so they pledged 38% reduction. All of them are more than 10 points below the minimum agreed on by the UN and will not change the situation fast enough. We have set the goal of 60%. Aim high and succeed. Aim low and fail. We have got to stop aiming low and softballing this issue. This is the time, this next 10 years. If we don't do it now, we might as well pack up our bags. We've let it go far too long. So let's listen to what the UN and every other country in the world is saying, and let's get on board. If we want to be leaders here, we can't be rolling around in 30% when they're asking for more than 50. We have got to show some guts here, and and have some faith in the innovation and the creativity of the Canadian public and the Canadian people. And we want the oil and gas industry on board with this transition. We're going to need their drillers for geothermal. We're going to need their engineers to build the infrastructure for the green economy. And we have a plan to employ them in the switch over to the green economy in the next 10 years. No one else has a plan like it. Not even the oil and gas people. I asked them last night, what's the plan? It's a finite resource. In 10 years, where are you going to be? We don't know. But we know, the Green Party knows where we're going to be, because we've been listening to scientists. And Elizabeth May knows everyone involved in the climate movement on the planet. She's worked with them for decades, and she knows the plan. So we need to get engaged with the rest of the world and be realistic about our targets, or our climate plan will not work. And that's what it's all about, reducing emissions. And so those are the numbers. End of debate. That's it. They've failed already.
Thank you. Okay, Leah, you would like a rebuttal? Okay, one thing I forgot to mention with the rebuttal is that I will also chime in if you introduce a new topic during the rebuttal. Okay?
The Liberals win when they paint a false dichotomy and convince Canadians that they can only choose between the Liberals and the Conservatives. We are not going to win on climate with this false choice. It is easy to be better than the Conservatives on climate. They did not even show up tonight. So I would like to know how the Liberals are going to be better, the best option, not just better than the worst option. Mr. Macdonald talked about the carbon tax and making polluters pay a price. What he didn't tell you was that the Liberals have given an enormous tax break to the biggest polluters to offset the burden that tax costs them. Pretty soft on climate. The Greens I worry about a little bit because they paint the environment and environmental issues as if they are separate from human and human issues. They are not. People are a part of the environment, and we need to tackle the climate crisis through a lens of climate justice that not only cares for our habitat, but cares for our communities who live inside them.
Thank you. Okay, moving on, if no one else wants rebuttal, to question 2. It's about water. So, many Canadians know that our country has the longest coastline in the world. Less well known is that Canada is home to roughly half of the world's lakes and roughly 10% of the world's wetlands. Canada is seeing the impact that industrial development and climate change is having on our water resources. The Insurance Bureau of Canada notes that since the 1970s, there has been a massive 250% increase in natural disasters, including floods and droughts, that are likely related to climate change. What can the federal government do to work with different sectors like municipalities and farmers to reduce both water pollution and the risk of flood events which have been aggravated by industrial development and climate change? Ken, you're first.
Thank you. I've sat on the Fisheries and Oceans Committee for the past 4 years. One of the first things we tackled was restoring protections, specifically habitat protections, to the Fisheries Act that was weakened by the previous government. We spent a lot of time speaking with municipalities, with farmers, understanding the challenges they face when it comes to waterways, drainage, and their activities possibly interrupting habitats. Municipalities in this province, farmers, developers, they don't want to harm the habitat. They don't want to pollute waterways. And speaking with any of them, I can assure you they do whatever they can to make sure that doesn't happen. But it does happen. We know it happens, and ultimately it's the responsibility of government to ensure our municipalities have not only the money to do the work they need to do, but government also needs to give developers, municipalities, and farmers regulations and standards that are clear and void of red tape. It's become abundantly clear to us that whether we like it or not, combating and preventing climate change from progressing isn't our only focus. Climate change is creating disasters across the country, floods, wildflowers, and wildfires. Extreme weather, it's all happening now, and that means government needs to take on more disaster relief than ever before. In Canada, we've paid out more in the last 6 years in response to floods and wildfires than we have paid in the past 40 years combined. We introduced a $2 billion disaster mitigation and adaptation fund to help communities prepare for climate change through more resilient infrastructure, and our platform commits another additional $1 billion. We're also taking on more ambitious targets by committing to protect 25% of our inland waters and 25% of our oceans by 2025. Thank you.
Leah's next.
If we are serious about protecting our water sources from pollution and mitigating climate-induced flood risks, government must step in to ensure decisions are not being made by people and corporations with no stake in the communities from which they extract resources. Here at home and all across our country, people are standing up against government negligence and corporate contamination of our waters. Most often, they are met not with an attentive ear from their representative or a legislative agenda that responds to their grave concerns. Most often, they are brutalized and jailed by our police. This is a disgraceful response from a so-called democracy. Too many communities, disproportionately Indigenous communities, live without access to clean, drinkable, municipal tap water. This negligence in service delivery is aggravated by industrial activities that contaminate traditional water supplies on the government's so-called watch. An NDP government has committed to implementing an environmental Bill of Rights to help enshrine the right to clean water and land into law, following the advice of teenage water warrior Autumn Peltier. As an MP, I would work to lift and amplify the voices of land and water protectors at our highest level of government. We cannot talk about water pollution and flood risk without addressing the tragic example of a development project here in our own province, Muskrat Falls. The Bison government in St. John's allowed townie-based Nalcor and outside corporate interests with no stake in what happens to the people of Labrador to poison their waters and their food chain, to put their communities at severe flood risk. Labradorians pay with their health and safety for what? Some temporary jobs and to line the pockets of a few elites. A dangerous hydro dam that produces more electricity than we'll ever need, a threatening legacy of a former premier's ego. Food and land security in Labrador has already been undermined. The reservoir has already been flooded. The government neglected to take necessary precautions to prevent the poisoning of downstream water supplies. Provincial governments allowed this to happen, and federal government stood by and watched. I will advocate for community control over resources so that this does not keep happening. I will advocate for following the lead of Indigenous peoples who have been much better stewards of this land and our waters than settlers or their colonial governments. I will advocate for control to be handed over to the people who will have to drink the water when the project's done. When the Labrador land protectors came together to protect their water, their community, their lives, they were arrested and jailed by our police force. This happens to Indigenous land and water protectors all across our country.
That's time, Ms. Movelle.
Thanks. Am I on? Yes, I'm on. As we approach 2020, our focus is becoming a little clearer, and we can see quite sharply the effects of the climate crisis and pollution on our water. You know, we have to adapt, of course. We have to stop building in the floodplains, because communities that used to experience 100-year floods maybe 2 or 3 times in a century are now getting them every year, every second year. And they're going to get more frequent, and they're going to get more intense. We will not be able to live in those areas that are, you see flooded every year on the TV now. No, we won't be able to live there. We have to adapt, and we have to repurpose those areas. We can make them into parks, we can make them into playgrounds, we can plant trees in them, and we can increase their ability to absorb water by doing so. You know, wetlands. We have a huge problem with wastewater in small communities especially. Appleton, the little town of Appleton outside Gander, has constructed for themselves a man-made wetland that deals with their sewage. And it's working beautifully. There are all kinds of creative solutions to these problems. Most of them involve restoring habitat. If you restore habitat, you will restore natural water filtration, and you will restore animal and wildlife, you know, flora and fauna will return. That's the plan, and we plan to protect 30% of the marine environment by 2030 and 30% of the land environment by 2030. That's a minimum that we need. We need that much in the bank to carry on. And we are also determined to legally enshrine the right of all people to a healthy environment. These are God-given things: clean air, clean water, clean land. No one can do without them. That's the basics, and everyone has a right to them. No one has a right to take that away by polluting that. No corporation, no government. So that's what we believe. You know, the Harper government changed the Mining Act, or changed the Clean Waters Act, or the Water Flow Act, to allow any lake, pond, or waterway in Canada to be used as a tailings dump for mine tailings. And since then we've had Sandy Lake and Star Lake polluted with mine tailings, and now they're going to pollute 3 big lakes in the central Newfoundland with a gold mine, and another one in the wilderness area on the Avalon Peninsula. They're putting a gold mine in there under cover of darkness, I might add. These will have massive open-air tailing ponds, toxic sites the size of football fields, cheek by jowl, mere feet away from pristine lakes in central Newfoundland, Valentine Lake, Victoria Lake, and Long Lake, three of the largest, most pristine lakes at the height of land, feeding into the Bay d'Espoir Reservoir and feeding into the Exploits Reservoir, the headlands for the Exploits River. They will be at risk forever from this 1 kilometer deep gold mine. There's several gold mines. Am I out of time? Okay, thank you. So yes, we have a real plan for dealing with the water crisis.
Okay, thank you. Moving on. Next question, next topic is around wilderness conservation. When asked about what they love most about our country, Canadians often point to natural beauty, wildlife, and spectacular wilderness areas. Yet we are falling below our international commitments to protect these spaces, and our parks and other protected areas are not funded at the level needed to conserve the diverse plants and animals that live there. A recent study shows that 50% of Canadian wildlife species are in decline. 87% of Canadians value the emotional and physical benefits of spending time in nature. However, 82% say that they're concerned that future generations won't have close or easy access to nature. What will you do to protect the quality and quantity of wilderness in Canada? Mr. Malone, you're first.
Well, of course, we have that 30% protected area. That's better than anyone else has managed. And you know, we have much more even-handed protection of our resources. When you think of the loss of the cod stocks in Newfoundland, that's wildlife. That was the largest biomass on the planet. We didn't lose it; it was given away. It was given away by Ottawa in fishing quotas to South Korea, to Spain, to Russia, in exchange for wheat sales for Manitoba and car plants for Quebec. And they saw the line on the graph going down in the 70s, and they kept doing it until it was gone. They had nothing but contempt for that resource. That was a secondary resource only used for bartering off for other resources. And they had no concern for those 40,000 jobs that were lost. They're still overfishing out there. They're still overfishing. I don't know why anyone would vote for another conservative or liberal government until they commit to stop the overfishing and commit to putting in considerable amounts of money to restore our coastal waters. Our coastal waters are a mess, and the fish farms are destroying them. Lobster fishermen coming to me in tears saying that the fish farms have destroyed the lobster grounds all around the south coast. And which is a great pity because they've lost their lobster fishery in New England to warming waters, and the lobsters have moved up here, only to be poisoned by fish farms. So that resource gone. You know, we need to have proper respect for wildlife, because wildlife is what's sustainable and renewable. When long after these polluting fish farms are gone, the wildlife is all we'll have left. But if you have people like CNLOPD out there who would like to see every seabird and fish dead tomorrow so there would be a clear path for oil production, they only moved off their seats when the public was outraged by the number of oil spills. And then they moved themselves and looked around and said, oh yes, we must do something about that. What are these people doing collecting their salaries? When that oil is a finite product, it's going to be gone. In 10 years it will be down. The oil industry knows it, everyone knows it. What's the plan for the oceans after that? They're trashing the oceans. The oceans will be worse when they leave than they are now. There's no-go zones out there. The fishermen want the oil and gas people out of those no-go zones. Those are fishing. Those are fishing grounds, rich fishing grounds, nurseries for fish, and the oil and gas people are moving in, setting off explosives, doing drilling, with the complete cooperation of governments and CNLOPD. That has got to stop. We have got to give that back to the fishers and say, well, if you want the oil and gas people in, fine, have them in, but if you don't want them in, we're pushing them out. And the fishers are saying, get them out, or we'll have nothing left in 10 years.
10 seconds.
So that's where we are.
The Liberals have promised to protect 25% of Canada's wilderness. But it is important to remember that they have already had 4 years of a majority government to take the lead on wilderness protection. They have clearly failed. and are now offering camping credits for Canadians to visit underfunded, underprotected parks. The NDP has committed to protecting 30% of Canada's lands and oceans. We have committed to strengthening the Environmental Protection Act, our most important piece of existing legislation protecting the environment. Most importantly, we have committed to enshrining Canadians' rights to clean air, water, and land in federal law as a new Environmental Bill of Rights. We've never seen this kind of proactive environment action before on the federal scale. Here at home, we have to be ready to ask the tough questions about industry in Newfoundland and Labrador. As your MP, I'm ready to do that. In our own district of Avalon, we're seeing Eagle Ridge Mining begin exploration inside the boundaries of the Avalon Conservation Area, right alongside of Salmonier Nature Park and the Hawk Hills Ecological Reserve. Even though our offshore oil production is out of sight, it cannot be out of mind, especially as it expands into fragile marine areas. As an MP, I will advocate for independent environmental oversight of our offshore oil production. We cannot afford to wait for oil companies to clean up after themselves. There have already been 3 oil spills this year, and companies haven't even been honest with us about the extent of the damage. I would work to change the status quo so the burden of environmental protection falls on oil companies, whose allegiance so far have been to their bottom line and not to our shared home. I would also work to ban seismic testing and further oil exploration off our shores. The FFAW has threatened to use their fishing vessels to protect crab fishing areas because our government isn't willing to do it. Fish harvesters have already seen how oil exploration and drilling contributes to declining fish and crab stocks. As your MP, I will listen to those who know our waters best, the fish harvesters who have been using them for centuries. In Newfoundland, our economy depends on our environment. It depends on a healthy marine ecosystem, which sustains both the fishery and whale watching boats full of tourists. Our well-being as Newfoundlanders depends on our environment. We love this place because of the clean air, the clean water, and the quiet shorelines. The climate strike just last week showed that Newfoundlanders want to take care of the earth. Let's give them a fair opportunity to do so.
10 seconds.
In 2015, we campaigned hard on protecting our environment, our forests, our lands and waters, and everything within them. When any of us picture Canadians exploring Canada, we think of people experiencing nature, appreciating our natural beauty. We formed government in 2015, and since then, we've gone from protecting less than 1% of our oceans to just under 14% in less than 4 years. Now we're doubling down on protecting land and inland waters through the Nature Fund. We've already been able to increase our protections there almost by 3% since 2015. And now in our platform, we're committed to setting new protection goals for lands of 25% and for our oceans 25% by 2025. Our $1.3 billion investment in protecting nature has put this country back on track to meet our 2020 targets of 10% for marine life and 17% for land species. We have ambitious goals, and achieving them is going to take working together with provinces, territories, with Indigenous peoples, with industry and everyday Canadians. We need everyone to buy in, and we will pull our weight as we have in the past 4 years. But we need the other branches of government and industry to do the same. I don't want to talk about Canada's wilderness without touching on a subject that I've seen a lot of talk about on social media since our platform came out last week. The low-income family camping bursary and complimentary camping experience is, in my opinion, a fantastic way to expose future generations to our natural environment, so they can best appreciate the importance of keeping our wilderness clean, healthy, leaving the land the way they found it, creating memories along the way. This may seem small to some, but I think until you've been in the shoes of a single mom living paycheck to paycheck who desperately wants to give her kids the experience of camping and enjoying the outdoors, until you see that, I don't think you'll really appreciate how much it means. Thank you.
No rebuttals. Okay, we're moving on to the next topic, which is oil and gas. There have been 3 oil spills in our offshore oil industry within the last year, and 2018 has been called a disappointment by CNLOPB CEO Scott Tessier. In addition to oil spill impacts, environmental concerns have also been raised with seismic testing related to oil exploration activity. The federal government proposed Bill C-69 in order to strengthen environmental oversight. However, this bill has been resisted provincially, particularly because of concerns about potential impacts on the competitiveness of the oil sector in Newfoundland and Labrador. What will you do to ensure that ongoing oil extraction is pursued in a safe and environmentally responsible manner? How will you approach potential new oil exploration activity given concerns with sustainability or further fossil fuel extraction in a carbon-constrained world? Ms. Movelle, you're first.
So there is no such thing as truly clean oil. So we must focus on curtailing our oil production and providing a fair transition for our workers. The federal government has a responsibility to ensure our offshore oil industry is safe for our workers and our marine ecosystems. We cannot count on the industry to regulate itself. There have been 3 offshore oil spills already this year. The Canada NL Offshore Petroleum Board has a dual and conflicting responsibility. On the one hand, they are accountable to their workers and our marine environment. On the other hand, they have a mandate to promote the oil industry. The NDP have committed to splitting the board into 2 entities so that one can focus on labor and the environment without a mandate to promote the industry, avoiding the glaring conflict of interest the board currently faces. As an MP, I commit to working with a newly separated board responsible for labor and environment protections in the offshore oil industry to ensure that oil workers aren't left behind in the move to renewable energy, and to ensure that this move indeed occurs before the irreparable destruction of our marine ecosystems decimates our fishery. Our focus must be on safely regulating and ramping down our existing oil fields and ensuring that no worker is left behind. The NDP platform includes expanding employment insurance and offering retraining to workers in carbon-intensive industries. We must work alongside unions to guarantee support and retraining for all our offshore oil workers, and we must resist further development. We cannot afford to double our oil production, inviting threatening, dirty oil companies who've been turned away elsewhere into our marine ecosystems. The temporary financial windfall, most of which leaves our province, is not worth sacrificing the health of our oceans and the future of our fishery. As an MP, I would advocate for a ban on seismic blasting and other means of finding new oil. Oil exploration is a threat to our fisheries and our future. We've already found more oil than we can responsibly take out of the ground. And once companies have invested in finding more, they will advocate aggressively to extract it. This is a risk to our communities and our fisheries that we cannot afford. We have to rein in the oil industry now. The government of today must show the courage it takes to ban seismic testing, and I will advocate loudly to ensure that this threat is treated seriously. We cannot kick the fight down the road, leaving future governments to contend with oil companies stubbornly lobbying to extract resources that they should never have been permitted to find.
We would like to see Bill C-69 strengthened to help it in its work. We live with a government here in Newfoundland that violates its own Environmental Act. This government had to be dragged to court, and the court, in its common sense and wisdom, forced our government to obey its own minimal environmental standards. The only protection we've got, and they were running roughshod over it. So this government cannot be trusted when it comes to the environment. They will try to deceive us as they destroy it. They're putting that gold mine in Salmoneer under cover of darkness, and they started the road at the back and worked towards the highway, so no one knew the road was there until it burst out on the highway. Except the fishermen who told me about it and are like, you know, up in arms about it, who go walk in there. We will stop drilling, stop exploration, and keep them out of the no-go zones. The CNLOPV, as I say, is a joke. It doesn't protect us, it doesn't protect our environment. We're going to have to do that. It doesn't cooperate. None of those oil rigs out there cooperate with MUN, with the environmentalists or with the scientists at MUN who are trying to save seabirds and fish life. They won't cooperate with them at all. They won't adjust their schedules, they won't talk to them. So like, what's that about? You know, that is hostility towards the environment. That has got to stop. So, you know, and now we need the oil and gas people. We need them. We need them to cooperate in this transition. We don't want any more foreign oil brought into Canada. We want to stop the importation of Saudi oil to Atlantic Canada. And we want Atlantic Canadian refineries to refine Hibernia oil. And we want Hibernia oil to supply Eastern Canada in the next 10 to 15 years as we transition off the fossil fuel economy. That's the plan. And we want to upgrade the electrical grid across the country to help, you know, to help the green economy and the circulation of green energy, and it will help also with the sale of Muskrat Falls power. That's what we intend to do with the oil and gas industry, is to regulate it and to phase it out. Phase out production and dry up the markets while we ramp up green energy to fill the demand. That's what has to happen. But the oil and gas industry in Newfoundland, when the Premier talks about putting all these eggs in the oil and gas basket, you know, you have to think, what century is this man in?
10 seconds.
The Rockefellers, by the way, the Rockefeller family is Standard Oil, the first oil company ever. Standard Oil, that was the Rockefellers, and they branched out into Exxon Mobil and all the rest of them. They just divested themselves of all their fossil fuel holdings, billions and billions of dollars. Got rid of the whole portfolio. Our Premier needs to listen to the Rockefellers.
Thank you, Greg. Let me begin by saying any amount of oil in our oceans from any source is totally unacceptable. Regulators of the offshore industry have said that all 3 oil spills off the coast were preventable, and that is even more concerning. Our government introduced Bill C-69 on a commitment to Canadians to develop and implement better rules for major projects to protect the environment, grow the economy, and restore public trust in decisions around resource development. I believe that economic development and protection of the environment must go hand in hand. It is no secret that NOIA is not pleased with the regulatory framework of Bill C-69, saying that it goes too far. It is also no secret that some environmental groups are saying the legislation does not go far enough to protect the environment. I believe this is a good indication that our environmental legislation lands us somewhere in the middle, and we can have a balanced approach to development and protection of the environment. But right now, the offshore oil industry and our fishery are vital to the overall well-being of our communities and the provincial economy. We all have families and friends working in both industries. While prosperity around the oil industry will one day come to an end, it would be irresponsible for any of us not to support a responsible industry that benefits so many Newfoundlanders and Labradorians.
Okay, a rebuttal request from Ms. Movelle. You have 2 minutes.
A couple of things on the remarks of my colleagues here. The Liberal government, of which Mr. Macdonald has been a part for 4 years, is responsible for the legislation that has allowed the oil spills on our coast to happen. They've happened on their watch. We can't just talk about we put a law in place meant to prevent this, but we didn't enforce it. We're too close to oil elites to stand up for people. The Liberals have strong corporate ties. And they've shown time and time again that when it comes down to the tough choices, they side with their wealthy donors and their wealthy friends. In terms of the Green Party's willingness to work with a conservative government to build oil refineries here at home and transport Canadian oil across the country, I wonder if they've considered that the Conservatives may not be sincere in saying that they will then agree to move past fossil fuels. Once the Greens, if this were to occur, were to help a Conservative minority build an energy corridor and increase the number of refineries in our country, the Conservatives could very well say, okay, thanks for the support, we're going to keep extracting oil now. The infrastructure is already there. We have to act now to move away from fossil fuels. We can't keep kicking it further down the road.
Okay, another rebuttal request from Mr. Malone.
You know, in the news, a lot of news about the environment, some things stick in your mind. What stuck in my mind was not just the acquisition of a 65-year-old pipeline that's leaking and that now we own. For some reason, we bought it from an American company and now we own it. Why did we do that? And it's going to cost $10 billion to refurbish it or whatever, so the cost of that's going to be like up around $15 billion for the pipeline, which we don't want. But along with that, the subsidies granted by the Liberals to the fossil fuel industry, to oil and gas, were so large in the hundreds of millions of dollars that they would not let the Auditor General look at. Unprecedented. The Auditor General asked to look at what the Liberal government was giving in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, and she was denied access to the numbers. You can only imagine what astronomical figures they are. That should have been going into green energy projects, because green energy projects generate more revenues now in Canada than the tar sands. That's the state of things. And if we're going to get on board with the future, they need to start putting their money, like the Rockefellers, into renewable energy, not into the past. So I just, you know, and it's because, of course, that the Liberals, like the Conservatives, are owned lock, stock, and barrel by the oil companies. We saw that, and by the large corporations. We saw that when SNC-Lavalin told them what legislation to write to get SNC-Lavalin off the hook and out of the criminal charges, and the Prime Minister just about lost his entire credibility with the country by trying to do what SNC-Lavalin told him to do. He takes his orders not just from them, but from Suncor and Husky and all the rest of
10
them.
seconds.
That's got stuff.
Another rebuttal request, Mr. Macdonald. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Catherine. To Mr. Malone's comments on TMX, it was bought because it's the safest and most reliable way to transport oil. We can keep transporting it by train and trucks. We've seen what that happens. This project, the tar sands oil out of Alberta, has one customer, the United States. They're locked, they pay what they like for a tanker of oil or a truckload of oil. This will make sure they pay fair market value for the oil for the workers that are working in that industry. On top of that, the profits that will come from TMX will be put back into developing clean energy projects. And to say that under our watch there was no environmental protection when projects like Hibernia went out there, we weren't in power when Hibernia was sanctioned. But what we have done is we bought in C69, which the big companies were upset that we brought it in, but not one oil company has complained about the new regulations, the environmental regulations, because they're on side with having these regulations in place. The only people who are upset are people who make money because of the oil industry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll be moving on to our next topic of fisheries. There's been criticism of the province's regulator for opening bids for oil and gas exploration in marine protected areas and in fishing zones that harvesters and communities depend on for a living. For instance, no-go zones are seen as necessary for conservation of fish stocks to support coastal communities, but they are not excluded from the use of seismic testing for oil and gas exploration. This seems to fly in the face of the spirit of Bill C-68 that aims to ensure greater protections for fish and marine habitat, as well as fisheries and coastal communities. How will you ensure the sustainability of fisheries and fishing-dependent communities in a province that seems to have doubled down on oil extraction?
By not issuing any more licenses for any more drilling or exploration, and by getting them out of the no-go zones. You know, and by getting them used to the idea that we are phasing down. We're very lucky we have light sweet crude. It's not as polluting as the bitumen, and it's you know, it's more refinable. It can be refined in Atlantic Canada with some adjustments to the refineries. So we're very lucky, but we have to realize that that luck is temporary. It's a finite resource. We have to plan for the finish of it. And so we have to dial down. And it's no good to be polluting our coastal waters still. Our coastal waters, you know, when they went to find sites for fish farms, they found that 70% of the ideal sites were already too polluted with septic and other waste. So we need to take all that money, the money that's given to oil subsidies, and clean up our coastal waters. That's what we need to do. We need to restore our environment, not keep degrading it. We need to, you know, repurpose the CNLOPD, and to make sure that the drilling that does go on in the next 10 to 15 years is responsible, that they cooperate with marine environmentalists and biologists and scientists at MUN, and that they obey the laws, and that they don't make a mess. And if they do spill, it's reported immediately, and it can be dealt with immediately. But no one in that whole chain of command is taking our environment seriously. Not the oil companies, certainly. Not the government. Not the CNLOPD. There's no one protecting it. And that's why the fishermen are so distressed and in disarray and crying out for some protection from someone, because there's no one protecting them now. Or thinking, but they're the ones who are going to be there in 10 years' time when the oil and gas is gone. And we want to have something for them when the oil and gas is gone. And we have to protect, and we have to get rid of that change to the Waters Act that allows lakes and ponds to be viewed as nothing more than tailings for mine waste. These are the kinds of things that have really put a strain on our wildlife, on our environment, and have really trashed our environment. The iconic Grey River caribou herd will be destroyed by that centuries-old caribou herd will be destroyed by the Marathon gold mine in central Newfoundland. There's little doubt about that, because they really don't care about it. This government has proven itself completely contemptuous of our wildlife and of our environment. And you may have noticed I'm passionate about this. This is why I got into the race. I think the environment is everything. If you've got a flourishing environment, you've got a flourishing economy, and you've got possibilities for jobs. That's what I want to hand over to our children and grandchildren. That's why I'm at the Greens. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. The fishing industry in Newfoundland and Labrador has sustained this province for generations and will continue to sustain rural communities in our province. No one needs to tell me the importance of the fishing industry in my riding. Communities like Portagrave, St. Bride's, Harbour Grace, and many more depend on the fishery for their very success. The criticisms around the marine protected areas and the permitted activities that take place in those areas have certainly been brought to my attention by my constituents. Harvesters certainly have a legitimate concern when they see seismic activities taking place in areas whereby no fishing activity is permitted. However, sometimes the facts around these areas are not presented to represent the actual circumstances as they exist. For example, some portions of a marine protected area have such deep water that fishing activity does not take place in those areas. In addition, there are many marine protected areas whereby no seismic activity will ever take place. I want to say that I share many of the concerns that fishers are raising about the marine protected areas and the related seismic activity. I can tell you that all 7 Newfoundland and Labrador MPs have had many discussions around those same concerns and have discussed them with the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and the Minister of Environment. I will continue to work with fishers in my riding and bring those concerns forward. We must not let one industry be negatively impacted by the actions of another. I would hope that all stakeholders could work cooperatively to overcome these differences. Bill C-68 reflects the views of Canadians and will help ensure our fishers can continue to grow Canada's economy, protect our ecosystems, sustain coastal communities. For our communities, it will keep the benefits of fishing in the hands of independent fish harvesters and the local area. I'm confident that with all industry stakeholders working together and with the guidance of Bill C-68, both our offshore fishery and all industry can work together for the protection and success of both industries. Thank you.
I grew up in a rural fishing community on the Huron Peninsula. My parents were both fish harvesters until very recently. I watched my whole life as they struggled to make a life in the fishery, and for a long time could not understand how people could work so hard, work themselves to death, only to gain so little. I watched and wondered why they could only sell their catch to a merchant who came to town once or twice a week. I watched and wondered why they took on so much risk and were paid so little, while people pay so much for fish. I watched and wondered why our way of life was stigmatized, why people who fish were painted by the boys in town as inferior, unworthy of preservation. Just move them all to the growth centers. There's no life in the fishery, guys. But why was life so hard in the fishery? Besides the obvious harsh weather and unforgiving waters, successive Liberal and Conservative governments, provincially and federally, have failed rural fishing communities by handing control of our resources and our labor over to distant, large corporations who have not a care in the world to give for our communities. We have to take power back over our fishery and reclaim all that it can offer us, looking to our neighbors in Iceland for a model of a fishery that focuses on adding value to the resource and making use of all parts of the fish. Respecting fish harvesters and processors for the hard, dangerous work they do to feed us is critical. Standing up for fish harvesters also means pushing back against myths about the seal fishery, a respectful and sustainable hunt that feeds our families and helps struggling fish harvesters eke out a living. Traditional seal hunters have told us that attacks on the commercial fishery is damaging to both, so we cannot stand for this misleading distinction. I worry that the Green Party misunderstands the seal hunt as they continue to oppose it without much analytical depth or rigor. I will advocate for fishery workers in Parliament with a voice born and bred in a small-scale fishing family. I will not stand by while our industry is neglected and its workers are stigmatized. Our most important resource going forward should be in the hands of those who work on the front lines of the industry, people who have a stake in what happens to the communities and waters where they work. I will advocate in Parliament for a worker-owned fishery, for federal and provincial jurisdiction to be delegated to local cooperatives in consultation with their communities where capacity exists. I will also work with communities to build this capacity, starting with pushing to establish a cooperative fisheries office, employing a handful of people to provide resources and assistance to anyone in the fishing industry wishing to form a harvesting or processing cooperative.
We have a rebuttal request from Mr. Malone.
Thanks. I've been asked about the seal question, right? And this is the story on the seal hunt, okay? I don't oppose the seal hunt. I don't oppose the seal hunt. Carry on. The Green Party, as a party policy, has decided to not support the seal hunt and fund the seal hunt. Okay. As a member of the Green Party, I am free to vote as I wish to vote. I am free to speak as I wish to speak on any issue. We don't have our votes whipped like all the other three parties. They have to vote the way the leader tells them to vote. They get their sheet in the morning, vote yes this, vote no that, say this, don't say that. We don't do that. So right away, a vote for a Green representative gives you more democracy, gives you electoral reform right on your ballot. If you vote for a Green, you're changing the way Parliament works right there. And as far as the seal hunt goes, the Green Party supports access of local communities and Indigenous people to the seals for whatever purpose, and even to creating boutique industries and that sort of thing. Where the division comes is the commercial seal hunt. There's a Norwegian company that comes in here now. They hire about 30 people in Dildo, and they clean the pelts there. All the pelts are shipped out of the island, by the way. I don't know why there's not more processing here. We would demand that. But the seal hunt takes much less than the allowable quota, and the seal harvesting techniques are humane. As long as it does that, as long as the quotas it takes are very conservative and below even what is allowed, and as long as they employ best practices, I'm not opposing that. I'm not opposing that. The reason they take a very low quota
10 seconds.
is because there's no markets. If they want to improve markets, they have to develop a reputation for respecting the species, respecting the resource, and a reputation for best practices and a quality product. But the future that we face is so grim.
That's time, Mr. Malone.
The seal hunt's not the answer to our future problems. Let me just say it that way. Let's not bite off our noses, spite our face.
We're going to move on now, Mr. Malone. I'm going to have to
Yeah.
ask you to stop that.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, moving on to our next topic is pollution and toxic substances. So Canada has made big strides to improve our health and environment by regulating toxic substances. Legal limits on lead in gasoline, restricting chemicals like DDT and ozone-depleting substances, the Canada-US Acid Rain Agreement, and the phase-out of coal-fired electricity have had an enormous impact on our well-being by saving lives, preventing illnesses, and saving billions of dollars in avoided healthcare costs. However, air pollution is still a leading cause of death and illness in Canada. In addition, our laws and regulations have not kept pace with emerging threats from newer toxic substances in our environment, including from pesticides in our food and other harmful chemicals in everyday consumer products. Many of these substances have demonstrated links to cancer, genetic damage, developmental problems, chronic illness, and many other health effects. These effects are often more severe for children and other vulnerable populations. Our overarching toxic law, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, has not been significantly strengthened in 20 years. Mr. Macdonald, you're first. What will you do to ensure that Canadians are better protected from the health and environmental impacts of toxic substances? Will you commit to strengthening the Canadian Environmental Protection Act and the Pest Control Products Act?
Thank you, Catherine. The choices Canadians make every day, from renovations we make on our homes to the kinds of cars we drive, we have a real and meaningful impact on the environment we share. Our government has committed to eliminating coal by 2030, something that will lead to a major reduction in mercury emissions, one of the most toxic substances. Our investments in green infrastructure will help reduce pollution that has made its way into our waterways. Towns like Holyrood, Bay Roberts, Spaniards Bay and St. Bride's, to name a few, are just some of the communities in Avalon which have benefited from green infrastructure. We are also working on a plan to plant 2 billion trees, which will produce life-sustaining oxygen, reduce carbon, and provide protection from soil erosion. Our plan to ban single-use plastics will mean less microplastics in our environment, water resources, and food systems. We will help bring clean and affordable power to more communities, and we will move forward with new clean electricity generation and transmission systems in partnerships with provinces, territories, and others. We will move forward with a new $5 million Clean Power Fund. This fund will support the electrification of Canadian industries, including our resource and manufacturing sectors, and make Canada home to the cleanest mills, mines, and factories in the world. It was the Liberal government that banned the import, sale, use, and export of asbestos and products containing asbestos, and the manufacture of products containing asbestos. We have also committed to introducing a bill to reform the Canadian Environmental Protection Act as soon as possible, and I look forward to reviewing the Pest Control Products Act. Thank you.
Canada has a lot of work to do to protect us from toxic substances, and they have not done that work. We have the highest rates of neurological disorders in our children in the world. Here in Canada, and Newfoundland is about the highest. We have high rates of obesity. We have high rates of digestive disorders. As of the mid-90s, we have epidemics of Crohn's disease, colitis, irritable bowel syndrome, and colorectal cancer. These things were virtually unknown in the 70s and before that. Virtually unknown. But since World War II, we have dumped 60,000 toxic chemicals on our food chain. 60,000 toxic chemicals on our food chain. And manufacturers are free to dump them there, and we have to prove that they're poisonous. That is lunacy. It takes decades to prove that something is a neurotoxin, and even if you prove it's so difficult to prove that something that a child was poisoned with when they were in the womb, or a small child, at 5 years old when they show symptoms of a neurological disorder, it's very difficult to prove the direct correlation. And so everyone is saying, oh yes, yes, all the evidence is overwhelming, but it's not conclusive. That's no longer true, by the way. Chlorpyrifos is a toxic pesticide that's been used for decades on fruits and vegetables. It's hard to say. It took me about 5 years to get it right. Chlorpyrifos. Okay? It's used for decades. They recently, this year, they've established a direct link between chlorpyrifos and autism. But they're still using it. They're just phasing it out. So children are still at risk. Scientists worldwide and physicians worldwide, and the Canadian Association for Physicians for the Environment have begged Health Canada to start banning these substances, because the evidence is overwhelming that these are destroying the birth rates in the world. Why wouldn't we act? And we spend in Newfoundland 50% of our budget annually on healthcare. Did you know that? What family can afford to spend 50% of their budget on healthcare? And we have the sickest population in the world. In 1970, we spent 15% of our annual budget on healthcare, and we were the healthiest people in the world. You look at the pictures, you won't see an obese person, because we weren't like jammed full of, like, you know, corn syrup and trans fats and high sugars. Stuff that we didn't know we were getting in the food chain, and suddenly everyone's got all these problems. We have been failed by Health Canada on a monumental, catastrophic level. And as health critic for the Green Party, I will be going after that, because the agribusiness makes us sick, and then the pharmaceuticals, they treat that sickness. We don't have health care in Newfoundland or in Canada. We have disease management is what we now have, disease management. And that has all got to change.
Thank you.
This problem, like so many others that we face, is born out of cowardly governments that don't have the courage to rein in corporations. Of cowardly governments who allow corporations to dump toxins into our waterways. Of governments who fail to properly legislate product labeling so that we know what materials are in the household products that we're using. The NDP has committed to banning microplastics, microbeads in hygiene products, which has become a major source of water pollution, putting the health of our marine life at risk. It sounds kind of silly, but those little beads in our soaps are doing a fair bit of damage. The ecological crisis is not just about carbon in our atmosphere, it's about the dwindling resilience of so many important ecosystems, from the Canadian Arctic to boreal forests to marine habitats. The climate crisis is also about human health. We already talked about Muskrat Falls, a project in our own province that was permitted to poison the water and the food supply of Labradorians. Across the country, many rural and Indigenous communities still live under boil water advisories. The Liberal government, when they were elected in 2015, promised to address all of those advisories, but there are still around 58 that have yet to be dealt with. Our ecosystems and our local communities are being further threatened by pipelines and oil platforms and other industrial development. The Liberal government declared a climate emergency on one day and bought a pipeline on the next. They say that they're for reconciliation and treating Indigenous communities with respect, but they failed to recognize the link between pipelines and work camps and the violence and murder of Indigenous women throughout our country. That is something that was brought up by their own inquiry on missing and murdered Indigenous women. That inquiry told us that with pipelines and work camps come increased violence and murder of Indigenous women. It isn't good enough. I believe that a clean environment is not a luxury. It's a right that all Canadians should enjoy. The point of our federal environmental protection law is to prevent harm to our environment and our people. Under the Conservatives, environmental protections were gutted. The Liberals have had 4 years and a majority government to strengthen the Environmental Protection Act and to review the Pest Control Products Act. But they were too busy working for big corporations and lobbyists to take protecting Canadians and our environment seriously. As an MP, I will advocate to better protect Canadians from toxic substances by strengthening the Canadian Environmental Protection Act.
Next time is okay, if there are no rebuttals, we will move on to question number 7, and the topic is transportation. In Newfoundland and Labrador, greenhouse gas emissions from transportation per household increased by 40% in the period from 2009 to 2016. There are more than 600,000 private vehicles registered in the province. That's more than 1 vehicle per inhabitant. In Avalon, there are few options for residents to get around as transit services are largely unavailable. What actions would you take as MP to shift traveling modes away from private vehicles? Mr. Malone, you're first.
Well, one of the Green Party wants us all on electric vehicles by 2030. There's part of the answer right there. And it's also, by the way, part of the answer to paying down Muskrat Falls. If we subsidize electric vehicles, and there's all kinds of programs to make them affordable for low-income families, and if we get everyone onto electric vehicles, and God knows we got the infrastructure for it, we got enough towers across the province to like crucify every Newfoundlander on it. We got a lot of electrical infrastructure. We can have charge stations right across, right to Nain if we want to. Let's put them in, and let's get everyone in an electric vehicle, and you have a huge base of consumers to pay down in Muskrat Falls without driving up household rates, so that we're free to go onto renewables in other areas, right? But we have sorely neglected transportation. For one thing, people can't get in from around the bay if they want to get in town. There's no round-the-bay taxis, there's no round-the-bay buses like there used to be. Everyone has to have a car. So we have to devise something clever, something modern, to get us in and out without all having to pile into, all getting into one car to do it. The rapid build-up on the northeast Avalon here, the rapid urbanization, witnessed by CBS, Paradise, and all the other areas, right up to Torbay and Flat Rock, the whole area has gone urban. Surely in this area we can do something with public transport, with mass transport, something clever, whether it's electric trains, whether it's minibuses, whatever it is, whether it's one express line right through with little feeder lines, and make it comfortable, make it sociable. You can grab your coffee, read your paper on your ride into town, maybe, as opposed to no one really wants to be stuck at the overpass, which they are in the morning on their way into work, and on the night on the way home from work. Just try to get into Paradise and CBS, like, you know what I mean, after hours. It's madness. No one wants to be stuck in their cars for hours doing that. They want to be home with their families. So we need to, and planning is like a dirty word in Newfoundland or something. Everything is like, slash and burn, put in another strip mall, and here's another subdivision, and there's another, like, it's dizzying to look at it. It looks bad, and it's inefficient. So we have to have better urban planning, and we have to plan for these things. If you're building a place with, like, you're going to introduce another, like, 10, 20,000 residents, what's the plan for them? Schools seem to tumble in after. Oh, these kids are going to need a school. Let's build a school. Like, you know what I mean? There's no plan here. We need to plan for these things, and surely we can do something with rapid transit, public transit, in that highly urbanized area of the northeast Avalon. And that's what we want to see.
It's 10 seconds.
Okay. Okay, that's it.
So far, federal and provincial governments have invested in transit for major urban centers, leaving smaller cities and rural areas to choose between pricey private vehicles and isolation. I know this struggle very well personally because I grew up on the Burin Peninsula in a family that didn't own a car, in a region with no public transit. My parents chose not to spend a huge portion of the family's budget on a vehicle we couldn't afford. They worked in the local fishery and they didn't need to drive to work. Many families cannot afford to forgo this increasingly necessary expense. My school is a 25-minute drive from my home. If I miss the school bus, I miss school. I missed out on opportunities that would have required me to stay after school. I'm almost 30 years old and I still have dreams about missing the school bus en route. That sense of isolation stuck with me. It's an equity issue, forcing families to rely on private vehicles, which they struggle to fit into their family budgets, just so they can function normally in our society, so they can get to work, the grocery store, the doctor, a social event, so that they can take their kids to extracurriculars, means working class people spend money they don't have, or shoulder the burden of isolation and missed opportunities. Our habitat will not survive a society that does not move away from private vehicle use, and working people cannot afford it anyhow. The NDP has pledged to transition to electric transit and electric vehicles, but as your MP, I will push to aggressively make electric transit a bigger part of that solution than private electric vehicle use, especially in small cities and rural areas where past governments have neglected to provide options for public transportation. I will advocate for the return of train services to NL, this time powered by clean energy, making it easier for people to travel between and within our province's vast regions in a timely manner that is both low cost and low carbon. This may sound silly, but as a child, I fantasized about the possibility of getting on a public bus to visit my friends in neighboring towns, or to make it to the afternoon session of school after staying home sick in the morning. As an MP, I will fight for free green transit that does not leave behind small cities and rural towns. Kids in rural areas should be empowered to dream bigger dreams than public busing. Moving to electric vehicles is an important part of reducing emissions when people have no other option but to drive, but as an MP, I will push to provide free, reliable, low-carbon public transit that disincentivizes private vehicle ownership, evening the transportation playing field for working people.
Thank you. In the last 4 years, we have made the largest investments in public transit in Canadian history. I will say that cities like St. John's have availed of these investments, and I hope they continue to avail of these funds in the future, because I think public transit is one of the best ways to curb our carbon footprint. However, for people that have lived here in CBS and are in Paradise for some time will know that this is not the first time that we've had this conversation on public transit. And what we know is that it's been a challenge to find a way to get public transit to work in these two biggest communities in Avalon. And as we move further out into the more rural communities in this riding, as it stands now, public transit is not feasible or realistic. That's why, quite frankly, I think this question is a little unfair, because I don't think it's a conversation that works in Avalon. What I do think we should be focusing on is how we as a government can incentivize people in our most rural communities to cut down on their fuel consumption, to drive less, walk or bike more. I think our carbon pricing system is a good start. I mean, not only does it make people more aware of the money they're spending on fuel, but hopefully it will push people to become more creative in how they use their private vehicles, carpooling being a great example. I think as government, it's also incumbent upon us to seriously look at how we can make zero and low emission vehicles a realistic possibility for residents in rural communities. As it stands now, as the Member of Parliament, I wouldn't be able to plug in my electric vehicle on the Trapassi Barrens on my way to an event in Placentia. It's not realistic for me and most of the residents here in Avalon. It doesn't mean it has to be out of the realm of possibility in the future, but we need to come up with a strategy that not only makes the cars affordable, but also gives people the necessary infrastructure to make it work. Our platform, along with our government's most recent budget, Budget 2019, promises to make it easier to buy an electric vehicle, new and used, install charging ports in your home and we're going to install 5,000 charging stations along the Trans-Canada Highway. We're also committing to helping make it more affordable to purchase zero-emission school buses, and we're going to develop a plan to help incentivize businesses to make the transition to zero-emissions vehicles, something we already started in Budget 2019. Don't get me wrong, I believe one day public transit will be a possibility, actually a reality for many of the rural communities in this riding. But I think right now it's a conversation for bigger municipalities, and we need to focus on what's more realistic for our communities in the more immediate future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Macdonald. We have a rebuttal request from Ms. Movelle.
When our government tells us that something is not feasible or that we cannot afford it, what they are saying is they will not prioritize it, that they will not spend the money to get it done, that they will not propel the issue and the political will it needs to happen, that they will not be a voice for that. Government not being able to afford something is not a good enough reason not to do it. The government has a lot of money. It's about where we put it and what is prioritized. It is a disgrace to say that we cannot afford to connect our rural communities with public transit. What that really is saying is that we will not prioritize it. As your MP, I will prioritize it. People on the Avalon deserve access to public transit, just like people in major urban centers benefiting from the investments that the Liberal government has made to transit infrastructure. We're just not seeing that funding here because it hasn't been prioritized, because we haven't been party to those investments. They've gone to major urban centers, and they haven't gone to provide transit to people who are most isolated in rural and remote areas. It's never a matter of we can afford something as a government. It's about where our priorities should be. And I think our priorities need to be more with everyday people who do not need a carbon tax to teach them that driving is expensive.
Go ahead, Mr. Macdonald, if you want to rebuttal.
For those of us who have never lived in Avalon or have never lived in this area, I'd just like to inform them that we did have public transit here at one time when our population was a lot less than it is now. We had the bus company, Fleet Line Bus Company, that operated in Holyrood, that brought bus passengers from Hibernia to St. John's on almost an hourly route schedule. We had United Bus Company that operated in Kelligrews. They brought me back and forth to work at the Salvation Army Grace Hospital back in 1975 when I worked in the kitchen at the summer of grade 10. Neither one of those survived. Even though the population grew, we have 27,000 people in Conception Bay South, 22,000 in Paradise. Everybody got their own vehicles, whether it's one vehicle in the driveway or 2, 3 or 4. People did not depend on the bus, they depended on their own vehicle. Those companies had to close because of the lack of ridership. Now, government could put money into buses all they like, but if there's nobody going to use them, nobody going to take advantage of it, they're going to be another drain on the public purse, and if that's the NDP policy, good luck.
Thank you, Mr. Macdonald. That brings us to the end of the questions, but I believe now we have some audience questions. Ms. Movelle, you are first for this question. In light of recent events on the south coast of the province, with a die-off of thousands of farmed salmon, how do you envision the future of aquaculture in Newfoundland and Labrador?
I think aquaculture is a really important part of our fishing industry going forward, but it needs to be done in a safe and environmentally sustainable way. We just saw the death of huge numbers of salmon due to warming waters. So what that shows us and what we can learn from British Columbia, whose wild salmon stocks have been threatened by uncontained farm salmon, is that the only way forward for aquaculture is land-based contained aquaculture, not netted open sea aquaculture. If we invest in land-based contained aquaculture, Not only can we keep farmed salmon from entering the habitats of wild marine life, but we can also notice when water is warming beyond levels that the fish can live through, and we can cool that water down. The federal NTP has already spoken out on this issue and advocated for switching our priorities from netted sea-based aquaculture to contained land-based aquaculture to give us control over the water temperature and to make sure that we're not harming marine wildlife with farmed salmon. This has been a particular problem on the West Coast because Atlantic salmon are more resilient than Pacific salmon, so they do better even in the wild ecosystem. We can't put the delicate balance of a marine ecosystem at risk, but we can still pursue safe land-based contained aquaculture. And this will allow us to keep waters at temperatures where fish can survive.
Thank you, Catherine. What happened on the south coast is unfortunate. Nobody wanted to see that happen to farmed salmon or even wild salmon. But we have to make sure companies are held accountable. What happened on the south coast with the recent salmon that died or perished, whatever you want to call it, according to the head veterinarian in the province, Dr. Darrell Whalen, he has come out publicly and said these salmon weren't poisoned, they literally drowned because of the lack of oxygen in the water. Now, he's a doctor, I'm not. So I think I'll take his word on what happened and where it went wrong. But yes, we got the regulations are in place, but we have to remember that companies are ultimately responsible and should be held accountable. Thank you.
You know, the problem. I don't know if it was warming waters. I don't know. Did it affect the fish outside the pens or only the fish inside the pens? Only the fish inside the pens died. Maybe they're a lot weaker than the ones outside the pens. We know that the fish farms on the south coast all the way over to Stephenville were closed all summer because of disease, and everyone was out of work. And even when these farms are up and running, work is spotty. It's hard to get a 40-hour week out of it. And the problem is waste. When you have millions of salmon confined in one area, defecating in that area, you're going to build up a huge pile of toxic waste. They deal with it with pesticides, and the salmon get sick, they're given antibiotics to control the sicknesses. Nevertheless, we have persistent outbreaks of salmon anemia, infectious salmon anemia. Those sick fish, by the way, are sold as just the same as healthy fish to the market. I don't know how long the market's going to sustain that. I don't think it's going to sustain it for very long. I think there's no future in the open net pens, and to that waste you add a tremendous amount of lice. Then that's attracting a tremendous amount of lice, and the lice are mutating all the time. They're harder to treat. You've got to add more and more poisons to it. Norway has concluded there's no way to control it, and they're moving along to land-based. That's what we need to do. We need to have state-of-the-art. Let's put one in Placentia. Let's put a couple around and see how they work. Let's do their work. The experience is that they create longer-term jobs and better paying jobs. But there is a better future in the land-based because they clean the mess as they go. They don't leave a mess. That's the way of the future. Clean as you go. Don't leave a mess for the population to clean up, and that's not our cost, it's your cost.
Okay, we'll move on to audience question number 2. How will you ensure that your environmental policies are socially equitable and inclusive of minorities, marginalized voices, and Indigenous people? Mr. Macdonald, you're first.
Thank you. I think you only have to look at our records. There has been no Prime Minister or government more in tune with making sure inclusion for minorities are there, whether it be Indigenous people, people of different colour, different race, LGBTQ community. This government has shown that we have made a difference for making inclusive, especially in decisions of government when we make decisions. We look at it through a certain lens to make sure everybody is included. So I think we've done a great job at doing that right now.
You know, when you protect habitat, you protect indigenous people and you protect their rights. You know, around the world, you have corporations like Coke going into like small villages in India, drilling down for the water, which they think is free. It's free. They suck up all the water. Villages that were using that groundwater for thousands of years are suddenly in drought, in sickness, having to truck their water from other places. They die. There's all kinds of, you know, it's suicide and everything. They've caused a tremendous problem in India until finally they've been kicked out of India, because they were not respecting the resources that indigenous people and small communities have depended on for thousands of years. Just like we didn't respect the people up in Labrador when we flooded Muskrat Falls, we have no concern for the poisoning of their water stream. And you know what happens. I know what happened in Belize, where people downstream of the, you know, of Stan Marshall's Fortis's Dam there on the McCall River. Those people ate the fish, they sold the fish, they drank the water, they used the water to clean. Now it's gone. Stan Marshall's answer was, you know, eat less fish. They don't have a Dominion store to go to. This is a complete, the corporate world does not understand the realities of life on the planet. You know, they're living in La La Land, where they think everything is free for them. It's not free for you. So, you know, all indigenous peoples, all Native American peoples, and if you look in the Bible, they equate the health of the land with the health of the people. The health of the land and the health of the people are one. It's ancient knowledge, we've lost it, we need to get it back, because that's where it is.
I think a good way to highlight the difference between myself and Mr. Malone is that he has just told us that when we protect habitats, we protect indigenous people. But I come from a point of view of when we protect and follow the lead of indigenous people, we protect habitat. That is the direction that this needs to go in. In terms of the Liberal record, Justin Trudeau can make a real nice apology, and he can make real nice promises. But if you've been paying attention to what's actually been delivered, I watched Autumn Peltier meet our Prime Minister in tears and ask why. He promised her people so much and delivered so little. How he could declare a climate emergency and buy a pipeline that puts Indigenous communities at risk, not just from an environmental perspective, but from a human and social cost perspective. The Liberals commissioned the inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women. They commissioned the Truth and Reconciliation inquiry. They have let both sit on a table and have taken action that directly flies in the face of what's been recommended in those documents. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Act tells us that work camps need to stop, that work on development projects needs to be done by local community members. We cannot ship in mostly male workers to continue to put Indigenous women and girls at risk for violence and for death. How can the Liberal government tout its record on Indigenous issues? The Truth and Reconciliation commitment has given us many calls to action, none of which have been implemented by our Liberal government.
Okay, we're going to move on to, yeah, or do you have?
Well, I just want to, I mean, in terms of protecting the people, protecting the land, I really don't think there's any light between our positions on that, because I think when you protect the land, you protect the people. It doesn't mean that we're not going to protect the people first and their rights to the land and all of that. So, no, we are all about protecting Indigenous people's lifestyle and their right to the land. But most of their complaints are about white people polluting their land, destroying their land, taking their land, poisoning their water. They got no clean water. So the issues are intrinsically bound together. That's all I'm saying. Okay.
Are we allowed to rebuttal during the audience questions?
Madison, are we allowed to rebuttal?
No.
No, we are not.
I didn't think so.
Oh, excuse me.
There is a difference, by the way.
Sorry, that's my fault. Okay, we're moving on to the last question, the last audience question, the last question of the debate. Federal regulations brought in 7 years ago require municipalities to update their wastewater management systems, but many communities say they can't afford the updates. How will you address this issue? Ms. Rowan.
Talk to the people in Appleton. They came up with a very creative solution to their wastewater. And I think that's what we have to do. We've taken away so much of our wetlands. The wetlands filter water, they clean water, they contain water in times of flooding and stuff like that. We never really understood the value of our wetlands till recently. But their ability to filter and purify poison water is incredible. And in Newfoundland, with so much wetlands and bogs, we can certainly start using them more, integrate them more into our communities as filters for our water. And I think, you know, we will get a bigger bang out of our buck by working with nature than working against nature. You know, we don't need to be dumping chlorine and fluorine in the water, both of which are toxic. One is an antibacterial that kills all your intestinal flora, the chlorine, and eventually is going to give you digestive problems. And the others are carcinogen. And you know, these are the stuff we use to purify our water when we really want to have it filtering through earth, soil, rocks, carbon, you know, wetlands. You're never going to get better water than that. So I think we have to start working with natural systems for the solutions to our problems. And we have to look, when we're building places, we have to look at water supply first and how we get it, as opposed to come in after and try to fix it. Like, we got a huge sewage problem here. We're trying to fix it after the fact. No planning. You know, that's what the Green Party is about. That's what we're about in this transition from oil and gas into renewables. It's planning, 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 so no one's left out of the solution. That's why I say we need the oil and gas people on board here. But what we need is a transcendent jump in our thinking of what's valuable and what's beautiful.
Could you repeat the question?
Sure. Federal regulations brought in 7 years ago to require municipalities to update their wastewater management systems, but many communities say they can't afford the updates. How will you address this issue?
Okay. So it's one thing for our federal government to regulate what can and cannot be done. It's another thing for our federal government to actually assist in that transition with resources, with funding, with consultation with communities. We need to look at the broad picture. Yes, we need to make sure municipalities are equipped with the funding and the expertise to deal with water waste. The municipality of St. John's, as we all know, is very behind on that. Only stopped dumping sewage into our harbor very recently. But, I mean, protection of our waterways goes further than that. Like, Mr. Malone is talking about working with nature. I don't know why that doesn't include working and following the leadership of Indigenous land stewards who've been working with nature in a way that has been much more sustainable than settlers or colonial governments. As settlers, we need to hold our colonial governments to account, to follow the lead of people who have been stewarding and protecting the land. Under this Liberal government, we've seen water and land protectors jailed and brutalized by our police. I mean, it's pretty hypocritical to require municipalities to deal with water waste in a way that preserves clean water, and at the same time let companies frack and contaminate local water supplies and approve a mega dam project in Labrador that contaminates and poisons local water sources. Why put all the blame on municipal regulation when that's only like a small part of the puzzle, and when our federal government has actually been acting in very hypocritical ways that wouldn't suggest that they have an interest in protecting the quality of our water?
Thank you. I was one of the MPs who attended the emergency meeting in St. John's with MNL and many communities around the province. Yes, there is a problem with our wastewater going into the ocean in many communities the way that it is. I said then, I'll say now, that it takes all three levels of government to work together to find a proper solution. The federal government has an infrastructure program which funds projects dealing with wastewater, clean drinking water. It takes a community to apply and the province and the federal government to be on side with funding that particular project. But what I will say is everybody out there was saying there's no solution, there's no solution. After that event in St. John's, I had a call from a company, Shamrock Manufacturing, in Branch, of all places, on the Cape Shore, in a community of probably 150 people. There is a company there manufacturing machinery that can be placed in the ground with a portion of it above ground that can handle up to 400 homes on the one system. And with the right system, what comes out the other end, they tell me it's fit to drink. I don't know if I take a chance to drink it, but they tell me it's potable water that comes out the other end. And they can service a lot of our communities. It's a very cheap option compared to putting in a treatment facility, a whole bunch of new sewer lines. And I will be bringing that information back to MNL and back to both levels of government to see why that hasn't been explored. They're putting them in trailer parks. There's a trailer park on the top of the access road, Avondale Access Road, has one installed and putting in another one for future expansion of that facility. It can handle the sewer of many of our small communities and they can do it cheaply.
10 seconds.
Thank you.
Okay, so that brings us to our closing remarks. Each candidate now has 2 minutes for closing remarks, and we begin with you, Ms. Movelle.
For over a decade of my very young life, I have been on the front lines of the fight for climate and social justice. I was asked to run by a fellow climate activist I met in Victoria while protesting the Northern Enbridge Gateway pipeline. At first, I was a bit hesitant, as I'm sure any young woman or any woman thinking about getting into politics would understand. I wished there was someone on the ballot that I could believe in so that I wouldn't have to do it myself. And then I realized that I could offer that to other people by just believing in myself. If my mother was able to be here tonight, she'd probably tell you that I've been speaking my mind since I could speak. And that is what I vow to do as your MP, to be a voice, an unwavering voice in Parliament for the system change needed to address these problems. Watching high schoolers rise and fight for climate justice has refueled my fire for this fight. I'm running to offer people, especially young people, the system change they deserve. We cannot avert the climate crisis by turning off the tap when we brush our teeth. Too much focus on individual choices without fighting for the system change we need to save our habitat will do nothing other than drain our movement's energy. Young people are rising up to demand better, and they deserve voices in Parliament that will not compromise. If I am elected as a federal MP, I will remind powerful interests at every opportunity that climate justice cannot be achieved through the sum of individual green choices. I will speak truth to BS in Parliament.
Thank you. No one can argue that our government has done more in the last 4 years than any other federal government ever in Canada to protect the environment and fight climate change. Actually, Stephen Guilbeault, a leading environmentalist running for the Liberal Party this election, says that no government anywhere has done more in 4 years than we have. We share the same goals as the NDP and the Green Party, fighting climate change and protecting the environment. But we're determined to meet those goals in a way that's affordable, that supports good middle-class jobs, and that puts people at the heart of what we do. After years of hard work by environmentalists, including many people in this room, protecting the environment is the top concern for Canadians coast to coast to coast. It's incredible to see hundreds of thousands of Canadians led by young people in the streets asking us to think about their future. Andrew Scheer would make it free to pollute again. He opposed our steps to phase out coal and to fight plastic waste. He voted against declaring climate change an emergency, and he wouldn't march with youth demanding more action on climate change. Elections are about choices, and you have a really important one to make this campaign. You have a choice between an ambitious and practical approach or no plan at all. The ambitious and practical is the Liberal plan. The Conservative plan, there isn't one. Thank you, and thanks to Leah and Greg for being here in Conception Bay South for this forum this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. I sometimes think like this. If it's treason to kill the king, how much more treason is it to kill the land he represents, to kill the very ground that we stand on? I want to make it a crime to kill the environment. I want to make ecological destruction a crime. And, you know, we need a quantum change in our thinking. I mean, I can feel it happening when the children are leading us down the road. I think we're getting there. You know, that is a complete reversal of how things are supposed to be. But it shows you just how we've clung to the past. Now the fossil fuel industry is the horse and buggy. And we need to look forward. I worked all my life to protect the Newfoundland environment on so many fronts. And this whole way of, everything we do in Newfoundland is, from the government's, you know, the government's philosophy is wrong. There's almost a belief and the level in the corridors of power that we have to trash the environment to make a buck. Now, unless we're destroying the environment, we're not making a buck. I believe the opposite. I believe that if we, like, why are people who want to trash the environment for a quick buck called conservative, and people who want to preserve it and sustain it for a sustainable, stable future called radical? Like, what's that? You know? I think that if we work with the environment, if we understand the environment, and we enhance the environment, we will have more opportunities, more jobs, and a happier time doing it than we've ever had before. I think there's a great future for us out there. I think we have enormous opportunities to do just that in Newfoundland. And most Newfoundlanders I talk to want to do that. They want jobs that build the country, not destroy it. Thank you.
That brings us to the end. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Madison and the organizers here and Manuel sponsors, and thanks to you for coming out and for being respectful, because we know that without respectful conversation we can't get anything accomplished. So thank you for that. Thanks to the candidates. We have a lot of food for thought to go home with. And thanks for attending the 100 debates across the country on the environment. And we know it's a crucial first step forward to creating the change we need, because what doesn't get debated doesn't get done. So thanks very much. Go vote.